What if I told you that all wars are started by lies? Either by outright deception,
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
or staged mass casualty events known as false flags. Public opinion is manipulated into believing the best course of action is to send our military halfway around the world to murder people we have no connection to.
You have to wash their brains and tell them there is a higher cause out there. It's religious, ethnic, racial, whatever. And for that higher cause, you can disregard all the normal rules of morality.
Wait. This all sounds like some sort of crackpot conspiracy theory. The United States government would never murder its own citizens to justify a war. We're the good guys, right? Today, we're going to uncover how generations of Americans have been lied to, have had their thoughts manipulated into hating others.
We need to send some cruise missiles over there right now and just start bombing the hell out of them.
Today,
All to line the pockets of big business and weapons manufacturers. I warn you, once you're awake, once you know the truth, you can never go back to sleep.
the military-industrial complex.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy.
We're going to start our investigation off at the height of the Cold War, 1962. And that's because at this point in American history, it was far from certain that the United States was going to win the Cold War. And in this climate of extreme fear, a nation 90 miles from American soil underwent a communist revolution. That nation was Cuba. Communist revolutions were a thorn in the American side for two reasons. Number one, the United States' main geopolitical adversary, the Soviet Union, gets an ideological ally. And number two, communist revolutions always come with the one thing American business hates: nationalization of industries. American-owned oil refining, public utilities, sugar and agriculture, mining and banks all had their assets forcibly seized by the Cuban government. 160 U.S. firms were seized in 1960 alone. That's over $20 billion adjusted for inflation evaporating off corporate balance sheets overnight. This enraged the United States because the previous Cuban government had been a U.S. puppet. It had been this way since the U.S. forcibly seized Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba from the Spanish 60 years prior. More on that later. But the consensus in the U.S. government was clear. Fidel Castro and his communist regime had to go. There was just one pesky problem. Public support for another war just wasn't there, especially after Korea had finished a few years prior. The United States government needed a Pearl Harbor-style event to galvanize public support into a regime change war with Cuba. And in the absence of a real one, our military leaders decided to manufacture a fake one. It was called Operation Northwoods. On March 13, 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff put this document in front of the Secretary of Defense for approval from the President. This is a memo prepared by the most senior leaders in the U.S. military, some of the most powerful men in the country. And they're asking for permission to execute a plan to lob mortar shells into their own military bases with some damage to installations, and then to make hijacking attempts against civilian air and surface craft. They're proposing to blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay, and even to conduct a terror campaign in Washington, D.C., exploding a few plastic bombs. We're looking at a plan to blow things up and kill Americans, and then to blame it all on Cuba.
This was a struggle of Cuban patriots against a Cuban dictator.
So basically, Operation Northwoods was to be used as a legitimate provocation as the basis for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. In other words, a lie to the American public and the world, a series of false flags to get what they wanted, and all detailed in this classified document that was only meant for a few people, with hopes that President Kennedy would approve in the spring of 1962. But unfortunately for our military leaders, Kennedy rejected the plan and was allegedly appalled at the idea.
Neither the United States of America nor the world community of nations can tolerate deliberate deception and offensive threats on the part of any nation.
He would go on to fire the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the main architect of Operation Northwoods. This all happened 1 year before Kennedy's assassination, which we will discuss later, but for now, let's see what this plan actually says. It starts with the US military base at Guantanamo Bay, where they would start rumors using fake radio stations and get American-friendly locals to stage fake attacks on the base, starting riots in the surrounding area. Another part of the plan was to blow up a US ship and blame it on Cuba. This was specifically called a Remember the Maine event, referencing the sinking of a US warship in Cuba in the late 1800s that the US used as a pretext to start the Spanish-American War. This was very likely another false flag event, and here was the US military at it again. The document predicts the newspapers would start reporting on the casualties, causing a helpful wave of national indignation. They also wanted to create a fake terrorist campaign on American soil in Miami or Washington. They wanted to sink boats of Cuban refugees and stage the shooting of refugee targets, and even suggested exploding a few plastic bombs in American cities. These weren't all going to be pretend. They even say they would go to the extent of wounding people and then making fake arrests with prepared documents so it could all be widely publicized, making Cuba look like an irresponsible government worthy of regime change. They wanted to have American Air Force pilots fly over places like Nicaragua and drop incendiary bombs on cane fields to burn them down using weapons from the Soviet Union. But for this to work, they would have to be flying Cuban military-style aircraft. They would need to have their planes properly painted. They would then use these planes to harass American civilian aircraft, making it look like it was the Cubans doing it. They planned a fake hijacking of commercial airplanes to blame on the Cuban government. Sound familiar? Or to fake shooting down a civilian airliner. And to top it all off, the Joint Chiefs planned to create an incident which will make it appear that Cuban MiG jets destroyed a US Air Force aircraft over international waters in an unprovoked attack. This was going to involve having an airplane disappear off radar, flying low back to a US base, and then having a submarine release airplane parts into the sea for search and rescue crews to find. The fact that this plan came so close to happening and was literally just one signature, President John F. Kennedy, away from happening, should terrify you. This was approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most senior leaders in the military, and it leads to some very real non-conspiracy questions. Mainly, how many times has a plan like this actually gone to completion? How many times has something like this been approved and actually started a war and then it just becomes part of our history? Well, let's go all the way back to 1898, the start of the Spanish-American War.
Major combat operations in Iran.
Forces are in the early stages of military operations.
Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and
Vietnam
Kuwait.
is also the scene of a powerful aggression.
A date which will live in infamy.
So you see, it really was a world war.
You see, the Cubans were fighting a war of independence from the Spanish, and the U.S. decided to send the USS Maine down to Cuba and dock it in Havana Harbor to protect American interests during this war. The ship was only in the harbor for a couple of weeks before an explosion ripped through the hull, sinking the ship and killing 251 American servicemen. The very next day after the explosion, American newspapers started reporting that Spain was guilty, that the Spanish had torpedoed the boat or they had placed an underwater mine underneath the boat to blow it up. This is before any investigation was done. This is before any of the facts of the incident were known to anybody. The newspapers started creating slogans like "Remember the Maine," "To hell with Spain." People started making speeches, poems, songs about this, and just like the Operation Northwoods document predicted, it started a helpful wave of national indignation. Basically, the entire country was begging for a war with Spain. About a month after the explosion, a U.S. Navy report came out saying the cause of the explosion was very likely an underwater mine, implying Spanish guilt. And a month after this report was released, in April of 1898, the United States would go on to declare war on Spain. The official story of the Spanish sinking the USS Maine lasted for almost 100 years, until 1976, when Admiral Hyman G. Rickover led a private investigation into the sinking of the ship and found it was very likely an internal fire of the coal bunker that had smoldered for days and then ignited adjacent ammo piles. This was very likely the explosion that caused the sinking of the ship. Another investigation by National Geographic in 1998 came to similar conclusions, that the very likely cause of the fire was an internal coal bunker fire. It's also important to point out that the Spanish had literally zero motive for sinking this ship. I mean, just look at the outcome. It caused outrage among the American population, and it caused them to lose Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba to the United States. However, the benefit for American industries was enormous. Agriculture, sugarcane, tobacco, bananas, mining, banks, all of these American industries benefited enormously from this territorial expansion by the U.S. This is because these companies could go into these new territories and set up farms or set up mines, and the American government would protect them with our military. The Spanish-American War was actually the start of a series of wars and police actions by the United States known as the Banana Wars, a series of military interventions from 1898 all the way to 1934 involving several South American countries, including the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Panama, Nicaragua, Haiti, Honduras, and Mexico. Officially, these were sold to the American public as stabilizing lawless countries and preventing European influence. Really, they were about protecting American fruit companies, i.e. banana plantations, and banking interests. Just to point out how insane this period of American history was, there was an incident where the owner of a fruit company, a man named Sam the Banana Man Zemurray, purchased a decommissioned U.S. battleship, rearmed it with cannons, hired mercenaries, and went down to Honduras to depose the president and install a rebel leader. This was because the president of Honduras was giving him trouble in his banana business. One of the highest ranking military leaders at the time, who was involved in several of these banana war conflicts, Major General Smedley D. Butler, would later go on to write a book called War is a Racket, where he talks about just how much of a sham all of these banana wars were. Here is a quote from Smedley Butler. "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested." Smedley D. Butler, War is a Racket, 1935. Man, isn't it funny how we never learn about any of those wars in school? Maybe it's because they can't put some sort of politically correct spin on it and make it seem like we're the good guys, so they just leave that part out. But wait, you might say. You're skipping over World War I. That was a conflict where we definitely had a justifiable reason for entering, right? Well, I'm not so sure. You see, in 1915, the vast majority of Americans wanted to stay out of World War I. Around 80 to 90% of Americans were so-called isolationists. They thought World War I was a European problem and we needed to focus on America. But this all changed on May 7th, 1915, when a German submarine known as a U-boat torpedoed a passenger ship in British waters, killing 1,200 people, including over 200 Americans. Just like with the sinking of the Maine almost 20 years prior, Remember the Lusitania became another rallying cry for those favoring war in Europe. American news media and papers began to run wild with the story, claiming it was an act of German barbarianism against a civilian cruise liner. President Wilson even commissioned an entire council on propaganda, propagating monstrous images of Germans as barbarians, all with the sole intention to get the United States population to beg him to go to war with Germany. It worked, And they did.
This propaganda they told us about them killing women and children and one thing and another. They had a lot of propaganda about that there. The Hun, you know, they called him.
However, what was not reported by the U.S. media is that the Lusitania was carrying almost 200 tons of munitions, making it a valid military target under international law. This fact was outright censored by the British media and heavily downplayed by the U.S. media to avoid complicating the narrative of German guilt. But what about World War II, the ultimate good versus evil struggle, often seen as the most justifiable war in U.S. history? The United States was, as the president put it, deliberately and deceitfully attacked by Japan, right? Well, there are some facts around Pearl Harbor that are not really talked about that much. For instance, in July of 1941, the United States froze all Japanese assets in the U.S. and also implemented a full oil embargo on Japan. Japan got 95% of their crude oil from America, so Japan had one of two options at this point. Either give up on the war or capture oil fields in the Dutch East Indies and British Malaysia. If Japan did that, they knew that the United States would declare war on them, so they had to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii before doing this. Once they attacked Pearl Harbor, they simultaneously attacked these oil fields. It went hand in hand. In fact, decades of war games done by the United States showed that Pearl Harbor, because of its strategic importance as the home of the Pacific Fleet and as a refueling depot, was critical to take out if Japan was to be in a war with the U.S. In fact, in January of 1941, just 11 months before Pearl Harbor, the United States ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, sent a telegram to Washington, D.C., detailing a Peruvian intelligence report of a planned and imminent Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. In fact, very interestingly, all three U.S. aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet were not present in Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack, which proved pivotal later in the war, especially at the Battle of Midway, that we had these three aircraft carriers still intact. And just 10 days before Pearl Harbor, on November 27th, the U.S. sent out a war warning to all commanders in the Pacific, warning of an impending Japanese attack. And there were several intelligence failures the morning of the Pearl Harbor attack. At 3:42, the USS Condor spotted a Japanese periscope. At 6:45 a.m., the USS Ward sank a Japanese submarine. And the morning of the attack, U.S. radar on Hawaii picked up the first wave of Japanese planes coming in when they were 130 miles out. However, the lieutenant in charge assumed they were incoming B-17s and ignored the warning. Now, don't you think that's a little odd? After we froze all of Japan's assets in the United States, after we cut off 95% of their oil, after we played decades of war games showing that Pearl Harbor was going to be the first place that Japan attacked us, after we received intelligence reports saying that Japan was planning an attack on Pearl Harbor, after all that, you would think that reports of U.S. battleships sinking Japanese submarines and huge waves of planes coming to Hawaii would have been properly heeded. Interestingly, had these warnings been properly heeded, it would have given U.S. naval personnel time to man their battle stations and execute a proper defense of Pearl Harbor. You know, part of the reason Pearl Harbor was so devastating was that people were caught completely off guard. Soldiers were still sleeping or in their bunks. Nobody was manning the cannons. So the Japanese just came in and loss of life was maximized. And just like the sinking of the USS Maine in 1898, just like the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, the public was outraged when they turned their radios on and they heard the president say,
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Could it be that the government knew that Pearl Harbor was going to happen and let it happen so that public outrage would be maximized?
Assuming that for the first time on December 5, I had all the important information then available in the Navy Department, it is my present conviction that I would have gone to sea with the fleet, including the carrier Lexington, and arranged a rendezvous at sea with Halsey's carrier force, and been in a good position to intercept the Japanese attack. Even on the morning of December 7th, 4 or 5 hours before the attack, had the Navy Department for the first time seen fit to send me all this significant information and the additional fact that 1 p.m. Washington time had been fixed for the delivery of the Japanese ultimatum to the United States, my light forces could have moved out of Pearl Harbor. All ships in the harbor would have been at general quarters, and all resources of the fleet in instant readiness to repel an attack. I cannot understand now. I have never understood. I may never understand why I was deprived of the information available in the Navy Department in Washington on Saturday night and Sunday morning.
World War II had a very interesting consequence, and that was for the first time in American history, we now had an armaments industry. We had companies, defense contractors, weapons manufacturers who specialized in warfare. Before this, we would have civilian factories, car manufacturers or manufacturers of peacetime goods would convert their factories over to wartime production. However, after World War II, companies whose only job it was to produce weapons of death and destruction came about.
Ordnance of all types, rockets, missiles, fire control, guns, and mounts are shipped from the Naval Gun Factory to our naval forces. Ordnance from the Naval Gun Factory to keep the fleet strong and so to secure the peace.
In other words, now, in addition to banana plantation owners who want to lobby the government for war, there is an entire industry based around war who makes their living and profits off of war who wants to lobby the government for more war. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a 5-star general and the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II, gave this warning in his farewell address to the American people in 1961.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
And luckily for them, even though the Axis powers had been defeated, there was another country they could portray as the boogeyman. A strange country with strange people. They spoke in a funny language and they had weird squiggly writing. It played right into America's xenophobic fears. That country was the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union. Immediately after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union both recruited former Nazi weapons manufacturers. The Soviets developed a nuclear bomb. They started launching rockets into outer space. The American population was terrified, and so when the threat of communism spreading to the Korean peninsula was real, America intervened and we got the Korean War. This war was insanely profitable for the military-industrial complex. And the blueprint for future conflicts was there. A country becomes communist, the United States intervenes. That's why the military was so hell-bent on attacking Cuba in the 1960s. So hell-bent that they were willing to orchestrate this huge false flag event, Operation Northwoods, just to get the war that they wanted. However, President Kennedy put a stop to that. He also fired the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He fired the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, over disagreements on the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, another failed CIA attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro. However, there was another communist nation that the military-industrial complex had turned their sights on: North Vietnam. You see, the Chinese and the Russians supported the communist North Vietnam, and the US and the Western powers supported the democratic so-called South Vietnam. And with the North becoming increasingly more aggressive with the South, there was only one pesky person, yet again, standing in the way between the military-industrial complex and full-scale war, that goddamn JFK. I tell you, JFK must have been a real thorn in their side. He goes firing deep state leaders like the head of the CIA, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He ruins perfectly good false flag operations like Operation Northwoods, and he's keeping the military-industrial complex from reaping huge profits in Vietnam. Boy, JFK sure was a problem. I'm sure they were all just real tore up when they heard about his assassination. After Kennedy's death, President Lyndon Johnson was sworn in, a man who loved to use his physical size to intimidate others. He would reportedly grab people by the lapel and the arms, shake them around violently, stand over them in an intimidating fashion, and even whip his dick out at inappropriate times, including to aides, staffers, and reporters. Anyway, it wasn't long after Johnson was sworn in, 9 months to be exact, that the military-industrial complex finally got a pretext to go to war in Vietnam. It was called the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. You see, there were lots of American battleships in the Gulf of Tonkin just off North Vietnam, and they were all on high alert after an alleged skirmish with a North Vietnamese vessel a few days prior. Then, one of the battleships picked up on radar what they assumed to be a North Vietnamese ship in the ocean. The ship, the USS Maine, started firing at the alleged North Vietnamese vessel, relaying back to Washington and President LBJ that they were under attack by North Vietnamese forces. President Johnson asked Congress for approval to expand the war in Vietnam, which they granted. However, later, the captain of the USS Maine would relay back to Washington that they were in fact not under attack by a North Vietnamese vessel and that his radar men were mistaken. This fact was hidden from the public. Another lie to start another war. The military-industrial complex got what they wanted. War in Vietnam.
Better run through the jungle. Better run through the jungle. Better run through the jungle.
It's important to understand just how much of a cash cow the Vietnam War was. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia was the most heavily bombed region by the United States. More bombs were dropped on these three countries than all other countries the United States has bombed in all wars combined. Helicopters, planes, tanks, guns, bombs, chemicals like defoliants, Agent Orange, napalm, all saw a huge surge in demand because of this war. A war that was, by design, unwinnable. The Vietnam War was never meant to be won, only sustained, so it could create this market for all of these armaments. You see, the rules of engagement that the U.S. military had to follow were that they could only defend South Vietnam. They could not attack North Vietnam, so they could never win the war. We would go out on patrols in the jungle, we would helicopter soldiers into remote positions, they would walk around in the jungle, they would get ambushed by the Viet Cong, and then the Viet Cong would just retreat back into North Vietnam. In fact, the U.S. military knew that the Vietnam War was unwinnable, and that's not just me talking or some kind of baseless conspiracy theory. It was proven with the publishment of the Pentagon Papers in 1971. These were a series of studies commissioned in 1967 by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara for President Lyndon Johnson, showing that the U.S. government knew that the war in Vietnam was unwinnable. These papers proved that the American government had been lying to the people for the entirety of the war, telling people that we could actually win the war when in fact they knew that we couldn't. The whole Vietnam saga really eroded public trust in the government for a long time to come. Well, that and the whole JFK thing, because I guess as it turns out, blowing a president's head off sitting next to his wife when there's very clearly political motivations behind it, and then lying to the country and obscuring all the facts for decades, I guess as it turns out that's not super popular, and it does make people question the government a little bit. Following the Vietnam War, America got a whole 16 years of peace before another country started causing problems in the Arab region. Saddam Hussein, the brutal Iraqi dictator who had used chemical weapons against Iran in a brutal 8-year war, who had used chemical weapons against his own people, finally invaded his southern neighbor in the 1990s, an act which, as the president said,
"This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait. I've got to go. I have to go to work."
Boy, what a great soundbite from the former CIA director George H.W. Bush there. And it went great with an absolute perfect piece of propaganda, a speech from a young woman who worked in a Kuwaiti hospital and saw Iraqi soldiers commit atrocities.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, took the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
This propaganda they told us about them killing women and children and one thing and another.
The testimony of this young woman was cited by President Bush in 10 different speeches and by 6 U.S. senators in the lead up to the Iraq War. The only problem? It was completely made up. After the war, journalists realized that this young woman was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. They uncovered that she was coached by a PR firm in how to give this emotional speech. Okay, but what about the gas attacks by Saddam Hussein? Those are war crimes, right? Well, the U.S. actually armed Saddam with the gas, or at least we provided him with the precursor chemicals and then just kind of turned a blind eye when he started using them for a while. You see, Saddam was actually a U.S. ally, one that we were actively supporting in his war against Iran. What about the fact that Saddam attacked Kuwait? I mean, that was totally reprehensible and a violation of international law and blah, blah, blah. Well, you see, the reason that he did it was Saddam found out that the Kuwaitis were drilling sideways for oil underneath the Kuwait-Iraq border and siphoning off oil from Iraqi oil fields so they could sell themselves. Oil and revenue that Saddam desperately needed to help him recover from the Iran-Iraq war, a war that the U.S. likely instigated Saddam to start because we don't much like Iran. After Saddam discovered this, he tried multiple diplomatic avenues to get Kuwait to stop. They wouldn't. Saddam then submitted proof of what was going on to the United Nations, which they confirmed. After this, Saddam summoned the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, April Gillespie, for a meeting. During this meeting, Ambassador Gillespie basically tells Saddam that this is an Arab issue and the United States will not intervene if he invades Kuwait. Boy, that turned out to be a fucking lie, didn't it? And you know, something else that's curious about this whole situation, why would Kuwait be so emboldened to take on Saddam like this? I mean, they knew they were a much smaller country. They knew they had a much smaller military. It almost makes you wonder if Kuwait had some sort of assurance that this was going to work out for them. Maybe a larger superpower. I don't know. Let's just, for argument's sake, say the United States. Maybe say the United States played Saddam like a puppet, got him to attack Iran, bankrupted him, and then had one of his neighbors siphon off his only revenue stream so that he would attack them, and when he did, they could start a war with them. Sure would be crazy if that was the case, huh? After the first Gulf War, America enjoyed almost 10 years of peace before one event changed the course of U.S. history forever.
It does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
Oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
Has
just hit.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims
I can
were
hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
I was just a kid when 9/11 happened, and like many red-blooded Americans, I never questioned the government's official story on what happened that day. That is, until the evidence became too big to ignore. Here are the things that forever changed my mind on 9/11. First, one of the main groups who does not believe the government's account on 9/11 is a group called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. This group consists of over 3,500 architects and engineers with PhDs and experience who have all signed a petition saying that the collapse of the Twin Towers from a physics perspective makes no sense. Those were two incredibly strong buildings. They might have been the two strongest buildings in the entire world at the time. They were supported by structural steel in the center of the building that acted as a spine, but additionally they had an exoskeleton of structural steel on the outside of the building. This exterior latticework of steel should have made it impossible for those planes to blow holes 80 feet wide in those buildings.
This was an unbelievably powerful building. If you know anything about structure, it was one of the first buildings that was built from the outside. The steel, the reason the World Trade Center had such narrow windows is that in between all the windows you had the steel on the outside. So you had the steel on the outside of the building. That's why when I first looked, and you had big, heavy I-beams, when I first looked at it, I couldn't believe it because there was a hole in the steel. And this is steel that was, you remember the width of the windows in the World Trade Center, folks. I think you know, if you were ever up there, they were quite narrow. And in between was this heavy steel. I said, how could a plane, even a 767 or 747 or whatever it might have been, how could it possibly go through the steel? I happen to think that they had not only a plane, but they had bombs that exploded almost simultaneously, because I just can't imagine anything being able to go through that wall. Most buildings are built with the steel is on the inside around the elevator shaft. This one was built from the outside, which is the strongest structure you can have, and it was almost just like a can of soup.
Understand that airplanes are just aluminum tin cans. They're lightweight. They have no strength. Even a bird hitting the nose of a plane causes a massive dent in it. To get holes that big in the World Trade Centers, you would have had to thrown a battleship at them. I mean, an airplane hitting the side of that building should have just crumbled and fallen to the ground. Also, those buildings were designed to withstand the impact of a Boeing 707. The architects who designed the building themselves didn't think that a plane impact would cause a collapse. But it wasn't the plane impact that brought the buildings down, right? It was the fires. Everyone loves to say that, oh, the fires, the jet fuel, it weakened the steel, oh yeah. Okay, well that doesn't make sense either, mainly because no steel-structured building in the history of steel-structured buildings has ever collapsed due to fire, except for 3 times it happened on September the 11th. Those are the only 3 times in human history that a steel-structured building has been brought down because of fire. And those fires weren't even that hot. Most of the jet fuel was burned up in the initial fireball. Haven't you ever lit anything on fire with gasoline, like a big stack of wood? There's a big whoosh, and then after the first minute, all that gasoline's gone. Well, that's the same thing that happened in the World Trade Centers. All the jet fuel was immediately burned up, and then after about 2 minutes, the only thing that was left to burn is like carpets and drapes and office furniture, just ordinary combustibles inside the tower, which should have never caused the buildings to collapse. Those buildings should have been able to burn for days, weeks even. Just look at this fire from November of 2025 in Hong Kong at the Wang Fuk Court Apartments. Those buildings burned for 43 hours. They were completely engulfed in flames. None of them collapsed. But the World Trade Centers that burned for 60 minutes and 100 minutes, they both collapsed due to fire. Fires that were, by the way, oxygen starved. You notice how the smoke billowing out of the towers is black? Yeah, that's because the fire needs oxygen. It's not burning at its hottest. In fact, the fire in the South Tower was probably about to go out when the tower itself collapsed. Just listen to this recording from Fire Battalion Chief Oriel Palmer, who managed to make it up to the 78th floor of the South Tower, the site of the impact, and said this just minutes before the tower came down.
We got 10 isolated pockets of fire. We should be able to knock it down with 2 lines. Where you go to 78th floor, numerous 1045 coal lines. What area you in, Oriel? South Stairway, Adams, South Tower. I'm going to need 2 firefighters, Adams Stairway, to knock down 2 fires. We got a house line stretch. We can get some water on it, knock it down, okay? All right, South Floor, we're coming up upstairs. We're on 77 now in the B stair. I'll be right to you.
Just 2 isolated pockets of fire, huh? Man, that sure does paint a different picture than what we were told about those fires. Again, these buildings are mostly steel and concrete. There's not that much combustible material inside the towers to begin with.
The media portrayed these fires as being extremely hot, but the fires were not that hot in World Trade Center 1 and 2. If you look at the NIST zone data, you could see this.
I looked up in a manual the burning temperature of jet fuel and found that under the conditions that existed at the World Trade Center on 9/11, that jet fuel had to have been burning at about 750 degrees Fahrenheit. I also noticed that the official explanation of what happened there was that The heat from the fire supposedly softened the steel and thereby brought the buildings down. If you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever, and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it. So immediately I knew at that point that the official explanation was dead wrong.
Now let's look at the actual collapse of the towers themselves. They fell down completely into their own footprint at near free fall speed. And the official story is that the floors pancaked. One floor slammed into the next and slammed into the next. There's a few problems with this. Mainly, that's not what pancaking looks like. Pancaking, when it actually happens, it goes floor, floor, floor. There's a pause every time it hits a new floor. These buildings fell completely as if there was no structure underneath them, which again just doesn't make sense from a physics perspective, because all of the structural components underneath the plane impact side of the towers is fine. It should have provided much more resistance when the tower was coming down than it did. The only way that a building can fall at near free fall speed into its own footprint is controlled demolition. Pretty much every structural engineer, architect, controlled demolitions expert agrees on this. And just look at how the towers are falling. It looks like bombs are going off at each floor as it goes down. It's like boom, 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 boom. We can even see these tiny pre-explosions coming out of the side of the building. These are called squibs and are only present during controlled demolition. Oh, and by the way, pretty much everybody present on the ground at 9/11, all the first responders, the police, the firefighters, yeah, all of their testimony, you can hear them say they heard explosions all day long. Even before the towers came down, while they were in the buildings, they could hear explosions going off. And then as the towers fell, they all heard the explosions on the ground.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
But it was another explosion on the far side of one of the buildings from where we're standing, the reverberation, and another explosion on the right-hand side.
And it sounded as if you had 100 of those little black cat firecrackers and you lit them all off at once. That's what it sounded like.
It just went ba-boom. It was like a bomb went off. And it was like holy hell coming down them stairs. And then when we finally got to the bottom, they were coming out on a mezzanine level there, and another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There was explosions. I mean, there was a couple explosions.
Yeah, while we were in the building. We were wanted for stairwells.
A couple of times we dove into the stairway. We thought another plane was coming. We made it outside. We made it about a block.
We made it at least two blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
detonated. They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
Did you know that some of the biggest critics of the government's official story on 9/11 are 9/11 victims and first responders themselves because of what they saw and heard that day? Oh, and by the way, pretty much every lab analysis of the dust from the World Trade Center collapse has shown that there's military-grade thermite particles as well as microscopic iron nanospheres that are only produced in exothermic reactions above 2,500 degrees. There was also eyewitness reports of molten steel.
Get down below and you'd see molten steel. Molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava from a volcano.
There was also molten metal seen pouring out of one of the towers just before it collapsed. And then there's this picture from ground zero showing a steel beam that has a perfect 45-degree cut on it with slag pouring off of it. Oh, and by the way, we never did a proper forensic analysis on the collapse of the towers. That's because the steel from the collapse was immediately shipped off to China and recycled almost the same day. This was actually a violation of U.S. laws on tampering with evidence. And guys, we haven't even talked about the strangest building collapse on September 11th. It's not the Twin Towers, it's World Trade Center Building 7, a building that was never hit by a plane that fell at free fall speed into its own footprint and created a pulverized pile of rubble because debris from one of the Twin Towers collapsing caused 2 small office fires in Building 7. Remember all that stuff we just talked about the jet fuel not being hot enough to weaken the steel, about how fires never bring down steel-structured buildings? Yeah, all that stuff, when looked at through the lens of Building 7, makes the story even more crazy. So crazy, in fact, that the mainstream media never mentions Building 7. Guys, I was alive when 9/11 happened. I remember it. I remember watching the news. I remember watching the specials on TV. Not once was Building 7 ever mentioned. There was some news coverage on it the day of 9/11, and after that, nothing. In fact, it was left out of the actual 9/11 Commission report because the collapse on the building is so improbable. Eventually, NIST, a government agency, would come out and attempt to explain the collapse of Building 7, and it goes something like this. Debris from the collapse of one of the towers hit the building and started 2 small office fires in Building 7. These fires heated up 5 steel beams, which thermally expanded and pushed a structural column 6.5 inches off of its column seat, causing a total and complete failure of all structural systems within the building. Guys, understand that this is basically like an old Looney Tunes cartoon when someone would remove one nail from a building and the entire thing would collapse. I mean, it is that ridiculous of a theory. Buildings just don't work that way. I mean, they're designed to not go anywhere. They're designed with structural redundancies, so if one column fails, the entire thing doesn't just completely collapse, okay? The only way that that building could have fallen down like that at free fall speed with zero resistance is if all of the structural columns holding it up had been cut all at once simultaneously. Interestingly, the BBC predicted the collapse of Building 7 25 minutes before it actually happened. Here's the news report where they refer to it as the Solomon Brothers Building, which is how it was locally known in New York City.
Jane, what more can you tell us about the Solomon Brothers Building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. As you can see behind me, the Trade Center...
Well, that sure is odd, isn't it? How did these people know that this building that just had a couple small fires going in it was going to collapse? Again, like I said, steel-structured buildings just don't collapse due to fire. Keep in mind that the BBC is a state-run news agency in the UK. And we're just barely scratching the surface here, guys. I could make this documentary go on for hours just talking about everything that I know about 9/11. In fact, if you want to see that, go ahead and leave a like down on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel. If we get to 1,000 likes, I will do an hours-long documentary just talking about 9/11, but very quickly, let's go over some of the stranger things. Let's start with the fact that the hijackers themselves were not devout Muslims. They frequented strip clubs, paid prostitutes, and drank heavily. They were also terrible pilots. The guy who hit the Pentagon by doing an acrobatic 270-degree down spiral corkscrew maneuver couldn't even fly a single-engine Cessna. Or the fact that in no pictures of the Pentagon crash or the crash site of Flight 93 do we see a single plane part. And just 5 minutes after the plane hit the Pentagon, the FBI was across the street at a gas station confiscating the security footage. You would think that the FBI would just be beside themselves, but no, they had the presence of mind to immediately drive over and collect this footage. Then there's Lucky Larry Silverstein, who overpaid for the World Trade Center towers just 2 months before the attack. 2 buildings that were filled to the gills with asbestos that would have cost hundreds of millions to remove. But instead, he got an insurance policy that eventually paid him out $4.55 billion, and he only ever missed work 2 days, one of them being September the 11th.
I was home.
Then there's the massive short selling of American Airlines and United Airlines stock that happened right before 9/11, basically indicating somebody knew that the stock value of these companies was about to plummet. Of course, there's the art students who were given free rent in the World Trade Center on the floors of Impact just before 9/11. And the Israeli nationals who worked for a Mossad front company who were seen filming and celebrating the 9/11 attacks and, quoting the FBI, appeared to have foreknowledge of the attacks. We've also got a gigantic gap in the emails that the DOJ has released of Jeffrey Epstein's going from 1999 to 2001. Jeffrey Epstein, who was very likely a Mossad asset in the United States. I mean, come on, how much more proof do you need? Just look at Operation Northwoods. They were literally planning on hijacking planes, replacing them with drone-piloted planes. They were going to blow up Cuban refugees, explode bombs in American cities. Look at the USS Maine. Look at the Lusitania, Pearl Harbor, the Gulf of Tonkin, the Incubator Babies. Look at every war that the US has been in and how they started. All lies, All deceit, used to herd public opinion just like we're cattle. Because people make billions off of war. That's why there were more defense contractors and private security in Iraq than US military. That's why Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, sits in on Ukraine war negotiations. But of course you don't hear any of this on the mainstream media. They just spoon feed you propaganda and distract you with circus. Because the world is a stage and you are a pawn.